How how can you have a better instructor than one that gets there before all of its students? This is great. We usually have to wait for our full professors. You know, they just kind of stroll in when they want, but you're already here. Thank you.
I figured you gave us a cushion by making it 2:15. We better be on time.
That's great. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. Is the sound okay this way without a headphone?
I think so.
Okay.
I can hear you real good.
Okay, very good.
I can hear you real good.
Great.
Everybody in your family doing okay?
Everybody's doing really well. How about for you?
Excellent. Yes. Yep. Yep. We're just staying away from everybody.
You know what? We make trips to the grocery store, but we're also very careful. The only people that we generally are around are family members.
It's this stuff is lethal. We keep finding out how lethal it is.
I'm looking forward to getting my vaccine. I think I'm scheduled for April.
Well, you're so young. You know, you're way behind here. This is the deal.
I like you more.
You young people, get in line. Get in line, you young people.
Hey, I'm going to test this while, the host is disabled screen sharing. So I think Andy's going to turn that over to me at some point, and then I'll just test to make sure that she also has good sound.
You bet. Is Andy there yet?
Looks
I
like
see
she's
her.
on.
Andy, what do you think about Brenda's sound? Does she need to put on her headset, or what do you think?
Testing 1, 2, 3. You're muted. Okay, good.
Well, it's amazing how resilient life is and how fragile it is and all those things, you know. And I think about, you know, really, really rich people who seem to have everything. And then you read a story about Tiger Woods, who gets in a single car accident and, you know, probably is certainly ended his career with all of his leg injuries, I'm sure. Golf really is a leg game. I mean, I know it's an arm game, but it's really a leg game.
Wow.
Hey, sorry about that. I was having trouble with my audio, but I think I got it figured out. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes, I can hear you just fine. And the recording has already started, but let me make you a host. And like I said, I can manage the chat for you. So if ever there's any questions or anything like that, I'll start collecting them.
Okay.
And then whenever you give us opportunity to ask questions, I can throw in the ones that were asked in the chat.
Perfect. And at the end, when I'm through, do you want me to turn the host back over to you?
Sure. And you know what? I'm just going to make you co-host. Are you able to share if I make you co-host?
Let's test that. You tell me when you're ready. You ready?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, perfect. So you can share just fine, so we don't have to pass hosting back and forth.
Okay. Would you like this up as a cover page as people are logging on?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. And I know that you're recording, but it's possible to go back and edit these first few minutes out if you like.
Okay.
Not that I know how to do it, but I've heard you can do that.
I think I'll be able to figure it out, but that is definitely good to know.
Okay, good. I'm going to try something else too. If I stop sharing my video, I want to make sure the sound does not go away. Let's try this. So can you still hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. I don't want to be too distracting. I'll say hi to everybody and then I'll turn off my camera so that they can focus on the presentation.
Okay, and the good thing is when you start to share, it goes into speaker view. And so we line up on a little line up the top and your slides take up almost all of the screen.
Oh, okay.
So that's good.
Okay.
So Brenda, would you like me to introduce you and do kind of the welcome, or would you like to just jump into your presentation and own that part?
You know what, I think that there's some value to you sponsoring this. It gives you the connection with providing this for employers. It's somebody who needs to mute.
Well, and I can help with that a little bit, Andy, since I know Brenda really well, and I can talk about her graciousness at, you know, bringing us into, you know, doing some work with us with What's Cooking Fresno, those kind of classes. And then, you know, maybe you can set the ground rules and she can take off. How's that sound?
Okay, sounds great. Thanks, Keith. Hi, Angie. Good to see you.
Hi.
Are you feeling better, Angie?
Oh my God. I feel like 99.9% better.
Oh, good.
Well, that's decent.
Yeah.
Congratulations. Glad to hear it.
And I did get my second COVID. My stepdaughter-in-law got me in through the hospital. I guess they were letting family go in. So got both shots. But the bad thing about it is, in between all this stuff going on, I had my mom and my sister passed away. So,
Oh no.
because of COVID. So,
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So sorry to hear.
Yeah.
thank you.
Sorry. Prayers.
Yeah, I got a lot of prayers, but there's always room for more.
Yes.
Good.
Mm. You're welcome, chat, Andy. Thank you.
And Keith, if you want to jump in so we can keep the timing well, we can get started whenever you're ready, and then people will just trickle in.
Okay. So okay. So it looks like we've got a fairly good group here together, right? That was great. So anyway, thank you, Andy Lambert, for organizing this and working with Brenda Butke so closely. And I get the privilege of at least saying we are very lucky to have Brenda Butke and Sierra Human Resources to help us think through what are some of the primary issues that we as community-based organizations should be thinking about in terms of human resources. And Brenda has been so gracious. She has come and taught business classes for entrepreneurs with us with What's Cooking Fresno. And she's just been an amazing technical advisor on so many things with different organizations we're part of. So Brenda, thank you so much for being here today. And I'll let Andy do any housekeeping or logistics with this, but thank you so much for coming today, Brenda.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, we're so thankful to you, Brenda. Thank you for doing this. And as she goes along with the presentation, if you guys have any questions or thoughts, I'm going to go ahead and manage the chat. And so you can pop those questions right in the chat and I'll start collecting them. And as she gives space for questions, you guys can feel free to just ask her directly, or I will go through the questions that were mentioned throughout the presentation.
Sounds great. Well, with that, we'll jump in. We know we're burning daylight and we're trying to cover a lot of information in an hour. So you'll notice that I'm trying to give you a broad overview of some of the key areas of human resources and employment law that business managers need to be aware of. But I'm sure it's not going to answer every question, but I'll handle as many as I can in the time allowed. I'm going to take off my video so that you can focus on the screen. And as Andy mentioned, she is going to help us watch for any chats. So I think you would join me in agreeing that if you have some autonomy and control and are able to manage a business and hire who you think are the right people for the job, set the values and the mission and align everything that you do with that, it is extremely rewarding. I can't think of anything more rewarding in business. However, it also does carry risk, especially if you are not aware of current employment laws and stay up to date with them. So I think about that insurance commercial and how it has the emu with his head in the sand. And we want to make sure that you don't just say, because I didn't know about it, I can't be held responsible, because our labor commissioner and the Department of Industrial Relations won't be thinking that way, nor will workers' comp. But that's why we are here to help you so that you can gain a better understanding of those basic HR requirements and really help get you off to a good start. Some of you have already hired people, others are just starting and don't even have your first employee yet. So wherever you are in the process, I'm hoping this will help you get your organization set up so that you can avoid legal claims. As Keith knows, I think of this as setting up an aquarium. If you've ever had one, you know that they can be a lot of work, but most of that work is in the setup. You've got to make sure you get the right fish into the tank. You can't bring a saltwater fish into a freshwater tank, for example. And you've got to be bringing the right kind of fish in that aren't eating each other. They've got to be compatible. And then you need your bubblers and your filters to keep it clean. And I think about that as being sound employee relations processes, your employee handbook, which is your roadmap for keeping the work environment productive and clean, if you will. So let's think about this as setting up the fish tank, and then, except for periodic cleaning and maintenance, it's pretty well set up. So please don't be overwhelmed by this. We can help carry you along with questions and support as we go. But I'd like to start by really reinforcing what Jim Collins said in his book, Good to Great. If you haven't read that, even though it was on the bestseller list for more than 10 years and is still in the bestseller list, I would encourage you to grab a copy of this book. It's how you can make your business not just be successful, but 10 times more successful and stand out on average. He said that people aren't your most important asset, contrary to the public phrase that we all use, because we know that the wrong people can also be our worst detriment. What he said is the right people are your most important and your greatest asset. We also know that if we had great vision and mission and values, like I talked about, if you don't have great people who are going to follow in alignment with it, it's irrelevant. Some of you may have also heard of the book Hire Tough. Turnover is an issue in business employment. I'm going to quote you a statistic that he wrote in his book, and this is Mel Kleiman's book, Hire Tough, Manage Easy. Because that's the case. If we take our time and hire the right person, it's going to be a lot easier to manage them. Whereas if we hire in desperation and we get the wrong person in there, it's like trying to pull an elephant. It's going to be much more difficult. Plus our turnover is going to be much higher. His statistic quotes that 50% of all hourly staff hired in the US have resigned or been terminated within 6 months. When you think about it, that's 100% turnover each year. That is something that we can help minimize and control if we take our time, hire tough, and then we'll be able to hopefully manage easier and retain the right staff, get the right fish in that tank, and we'll keep them longer. You may have also heard of Dee Hock. He was the founder of Visa Corporation. And this is something, when I started in human resources years ago, I remember recruiting was one of my early functions. And this wasn't something we talked about then, that you don't need to hire for experience first and foremost. We always looked for experience. And then we started saying you need to get the knowledge, skills, and experience, or you may have heard of knowledge, skills, and abilities, KSAs. This is something that I find so powerful that I have printed this statement from Mr. Hawk, and I've got it on my bulletin board even right now. And you can see that he says, hire and promote first on the basis of integrity, then motivation, then capacity, then understanding, then knowledge, and last and least, experience. Now, it does depend on the job that you're seeking, because if we're doing brain surgery or heart surgery, of course, we don't want it to just be, I'm going to be full of integrity and tell you I don't know what I'm doing, so let's pray a lot. Obviously, you'll want to customize this based on the position. But Listen to this explanation. Without integrity, motivation is dangerous. Wouldn't that be true even if we had a talented heart surgeon or brain surgeon and they needed the money, so they did the surgery even though it wasn't needed? That can be very dangerous. Without motivation, people having the capacity to learn and understand would be irrelevant. It'd be impotent. You've got to have the motivation to tap into that capacity. Without capacity, meaning a bucket full, a bucket ready to understand more, then understanding is limited because it's got to be able to grow and apply. Without understanding, then you can memorize things, but it's meaningless. And without knowledge, experience is blind. Really, experience can be gotten in most positions and quickly put to good use if you start with integrity and motivation first. So I really like that. I hope you find that helpful when you're looking to hire. And think about first up front. It's not too late if you're already in midstream with your business, but really think about, have I clarified and identified what I believe makes or breaks our success as an organization? The values are my compass, and they may be quality, they may be customer service, teamwork, communication. Definitely put integrity in there. So no matter what our mission is, our mission may be healthcare or serving the community or helping people find employment or manufacturing or creating food, whatever that is, those values may be very similar in many of our organizations. And we need to identify them first so that we can apply them to the interview process to get the right fish in the tank and align all of our decisions in employment with that. So we want to put these on the job descriptions. We want to make sure that they're carried over into the performance evaluations. So what we say we hold people accountable for, we actually evaluate them on. So that would be a suggestion I would have in identifying that. If you haven't already done so and need any help with that, you feel free to reach out with an email. But this would be a sound foundation. This will also help in the next step, which is how do you help after all that time and money and your resources invested in finding the right person to get in your tank? How do you keep them? Because according to a study by Bamboo HR, employees who had quit their job within 6 months, and remember Mel Kleinman in his book said 50% of all your staff who are hourly will be quitting. Is there a question so far? It may just be that somebody, Gabriel, might need to mute. Thank you. So of those, the people who quit within 6 months stated a quarter of them said that they hadn't received clear guidelines. This is really important, especially to adults, because we need to feel like we can understand the goal and meet the goal. And if we don't know what the guidelines are, we're a fish flopping out on the sand. A lot of them, 21% said they wanted more effective training. So based on this, and you know that turnover, churn as we call it, is very costly and it's disruptive to your team. So we want to try to hire the right person the first time and then set them up with training and a really effective onboarding process so they feel like they know what the goals are, they feel a fit, and that we're going to try to give them the best first day ever, because that's a memorable impression that's sketched on their brains. If we can do something that helps them have a sense of teamwork, including taking them to lunch or having a plant on their desk with a note that everyone has signed, welcome aboard, something to make them know that they feel a part of something bigger. That is also going to help them be more productive earlier. And then having those guidelines set out in an onboarding orientation will also help make sure they understand your values, what's expected of them in their job role, and also that they follow all the policies that are in your handbook. So there is a lot of regulations. Let me stop and ask, do you have any questions so far on our introductory comments about hiring? I'm not going to go into depth due to time restraints on interview questions, but is there anything I can stop and answer so far before we segue into some of the key regulations? Okay. If not, Andy's going to help me watch the chat too, and I'll pause periodically for that. California, I sometimes refer to as a country of its own. Oftentimes we've got different or a higher standard law than even federal law of the land. And when those are different, when they conflict, okay, here's a question I'm going to award points for. When federal and state laws conflict, in general, which do you think we must follow? How do we know? 10 seconds for an answer. Any guesses?
Federal?
Oh, well, that is a great guess because federal sounds like the highest law of the land, right?
Yeah.
You may think that. So thank you for chiming in for that. I appreciate that. In general, here's the answer. The law that's most restrictive to the employer and most generous to the employee is the one we need to follow. That's the definition. But I can tell you that California is kind of like a country of its own. Most often when we differ, our laws are at a higher level, a higher standard of enforcement for business than they are federal law. So in most cases, California law is going to be the higher standard that we must follow. Now, there are a couple of exceptions that I can think of, and one of those happens to be the marijuana law. California says it's permissible in some situations, and federal law says it's still classified as a category 2 and is unlawful, even though the state says it is lawful. So federal law will trump in that case. But that's the definition, the law most restrictive to the employer, because we're the ones that allegedly have the greatest amount of power and clout, and it needs to be more generous to the employee who doesn't have as much say in it. That's California's position most often. So why is it important for business managers and supervisors to know HR law? Isn't that HR's job? Well, I would say in many cases, small businesses that are starting up are getting their HR functions covered by somebody else that is trying to learn and wear multiple hats. It may be someone in finance, for example, or one of the general managers themselves. So for one reason, it's because we may not have a designated HR function till we get up to 50 or 75 employees. But I would also suggest that we need a basic level of HR employment law for other reasons. One is that the supervisors are usually the one that employees will interact with the most, and they may be the ones to hear something from the employee, such as, my mom is sick, she's in the hospital, I need to take some time off. And supervisors need to know when is leave required, when is the employee eligible, and when is it mandated by the company. So you may hear some of those comments first. In addition, if employees aren't happy about some decision or a performance appraisal or a working condition or a write-up, they may Google to find out what the law says and what their rights are. And so they have those research tools at their fingertips, so we need to at least know what they have access to as well. In addition to that, owners, and in some cases, even managers, have some liability if there's a claim of discrimination. May I just give a reminder to everyone, if you could please mute your phones. Perfect, thank you. So owners, and in some cases, such as discrimination, managers will have personal liability associated with claims. So we don't want any of our homes up at risk. And many times too, once you get an HR professional, if you are large enough to have your own HR department, you may get to the point where you want to get your fish out of the tank. You say, I've told them, I'm finally done, I want them out of here. And HR says, show me your coaching records, show me your written write-ups so that we know we've got this well backed up. And you can say, no, I've just been telling them, they should know. Well, HR is probably going to say, we're not ready to terminate until we can show that we have walked them through what was required, which is why a job description is so important, that you coach them when they're off track from their values, off track from their job duties, and that they knew the consequences, that this was so important that their job may be at risk. So those darn HR people are going to say, you know, we may agree with you that we're better off without them, but we're not ready yet because you haven't got the documentation to show that you let them know. Unless it's something egregious like drugs in the workplace or theft or fighting, then obviously that's severe enough that we don't have to have that trail. So when your employees Google, I did it just to see what would come up. Guess what? There were 49,900,000 results about how to file a complaint against your employer. And so if you Google it, you'll see they have many resources right at their fingertips. We want to make sure that we help get it right so that they're not going outside to try to get a fair shake. All right, moving us along. Wage and hour is one of the most important laws that even if you have only one employee, we need to make sure we do this right. And how we get this information is from the Industrial Welfare Commission. You can even Google IWC, Industrial Welfare Commission, and see that there are wage orders that spell out everything from what time people have to take their meal period, how often should they take their break, even is providing a seat to the employee required. And there's 17 different wage orders that cover different industries. Many of us who are in business industries are under wage order 4, for example. So if you want to look up a wage order, input wage order 4, it covers businesses that are from legal to CPAs to a majority of our businesses out there, but there are also wage orders for minimum wage. The California minimum wage order has been updated. It's under IWC. You'll also notice that there's DIR, that's the Department of Industrial Relations, that posts and updates these. And they're for covering industries, but also occupations. So if there's not a wage order for your particular industry, and by the way, there's 2 for agriculture, there's manufacturing, there's even one for the motion picture industry. So you can scroll what those are. We also are going to refer to the California Labor Code for guidelines specific to what California businesses have to apply. And then in order to make sure that there have not been precedents set by the DLSE, we also can look at opinion letters. So those are all areas I wanted to give you so that you can Google to get some information. But here's just a snapshot of some of the wage orders. You can see wage order 4, I mentioned, professional, technical, clerical, mechanical, similar, but they're from manufacturing to even hotel industry, public housekeeping has a couple, and then handling products before and after harvesting, those with heavy power equipment. Very interesting. If you didn't know about wage orders before, in your spare time, you might want to Google to make sure you know which wage order your business has to follow. And then look it up. It has to be posted near your mandatory posters. That's a requirement that can come with penalties if you don't print out your wage order. It must be mounted up on the wall where employees can see it, along with your minimum wage and leave of absence poster. So here are some of the things that actually are spelled out, the regulations in the wage orders, from what the minimum wage is when you have to pay overtime, if you want to try to schedule and vote in an alternative work week schedule, such as I have many employers call and say, hey, you know, we know somebody who has 4 shifts, they work 10 hours each day, and employees have an extra day off every week. They really like it. I think we're going to adopt that. And I say, well, let's be careful. Let's go and make sure that you follow all the requirements that happen to be printed in your wage order that say what you must do, including sending out a notice to employees about this possibility, and that you must have a meeting to discuss it. You must put out a printed document that says how will you handle vacations and holidays, other issues, and that has to be given to them at least 14 days before you hold a secret ballot vote. And so it has to be passed with a secret ballot vote with signatures of who all attended this meeting. It has to be sent to people at home if they're working remotely or on a leave of absence. This is a very costly mistake if you don't follow the guidelines for this, because you could be subject to back pay on overtime that was not paid if this is not adopted and filed with the state of California. It has to be posted out on their website. So there are a lot of other areas, including what do you do with uniforms? What if you are in the camping business for campgrounds? Yes, you can use part of their lodging costs and meals to offset their minimum wage payments. So all kinds of neat stuff, even what the temperature needs to be and what you need to do, and providing seats. So they're dry to read, but if you go through and look at them, they are filled with information. Well, speaking of minimum wage, I just wanted to mention and make sure everyone knows about minimum wage and how that was changing, that we've got in a step plan for increasing our minimum wage. So in California, it's broken out by smaller employees who have 25 or fewer. Those employers should be at 13 an hour. And if you've got 26 or more, you should be at 14 an hour right now for your employees. And that's going to be up to $15 by January of 2023. Something that we are watching is the federal Raise the Wage Act that would raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025. So that is something that federal wage has not increased from $7.25 since 2009. So some version of this is likely to pass because they haven't had much movement in a while.
Brenda, before we head into the next section, we do have a couple of questions in regards to posting, as well as how wage affects nonprofits. Is there a different standard, or is it all the same?
Good question. You know, there are reduced wage opportunities for apprentices that you can pay 15% less than minimum wage for a period of time. But in general, it's my understanding, and there could be some carve-out exceptions if there's specific federal funding, that some of them may possibly go to federal wage instead of California state wage. I have seen that a couple of times. But for the most part, all of us are responsible for this minimum wage, except for certain short periods of time where someone is in a learning or apprentice stage.
Okay, and as far as posting, if they do not have an office, where is the standard posting place with that? I know you mentioned the website.
Yes, great question. And most of us have at least some percentage of our staff working remotely right now. So some of it may never return completely, fully to normal in brick and mortar. It's a good idea to send an email of this mandatory poster to employees if you don't have an intranet. If you don't have an internal computer site, I would recommend that you send a snapshot of the poster that can be expanded, because they have to be able to see it in at least 12 to 14 font. We don't want this little itty bitty postage stamp poster sent to them, so that then there is an email return receipt to say that they did receive it. That's what I would recommend if their employees are working from home. But otherwise, generally, it's recommended that it goes in the break room or near the copier or someplace that employees, more usually in a non-COVID period, would be highly visiting. They call it a well-trafficked area.
Okay, and is there a place that you would recommend where we access these posters?
You know, Cal Chamber has them. I'm not advocating for any one source. There's also laborlaw.com, but the important point is to make sure that it does have California information. So when you look this up, maybe under Cal Chamber, you know, Cal Chamber will have California guidelines. And most labor law, that we get ours through those sources because we have verified that they have California accurate information on there.
Okay. And one more question, are there wage orders for nonprofits?
So the list of 17 doesn't have one that's just nonprofit. You would look to see, do you fall in administration? Are you a nonprofit that's supporting in a finance, funding, program management capacity? You'd probably fall under wage order 4.
Okay, and I'm going to jump and just do one more. Esther asked that if they're in a shared office space with another organization, can the poster, the information be shared between the two of them, or should each organization post their own?
So there's 2 organizations and they have employees from both organizations sharing one office?
Yes.
Okay, as long as the information is relevant to both. Do they have the same workers' comp plan, for example? Because you must handwrite in your workers' comp policy number and phone number. You must write in when paydays are. So is that the same information? And if so, then that should work, but you need to have both company names on the poster and the information needs to be the same.
Okay, thank you, Brenda.
You're welcome. Okay, so a little bit more about wage and hour. I know this is where the penalties can rack up because there are attorneys from the Bay Area and from Southern California that have been accepting complaints from employees and then asking to see their paycheck stubs to see if there's anything else that might be missing. You know, did you get your meal period on time? They're going to ask for time cards to support this. So I wanted to just briefly cover what the guidelines were because this is a high risk area for employers. An employee whose shift is 5 hours or more. So if they're working more than 5 hours, they're entitled to a 30-minute uninterrupted meal period. It's not paid, but you can't say, hey, can you grab me the file real quick or tell me where it is? Because otherwise you've interrupted them and they get to start over. So we want to make sure. Now there is an exception, is if their shift is part-time and they're not going to work a full 6 hours, they're going to work less than 5 hours and 55 minutes, say, for example, leave a little cushion there. You don't want to accidentally go over, then they can waive that meal period. But keep in mind too, on the other hand, if an employee is working more than 10 hours, they're entitled to a second meal period, which can be waived unless they waive the first meal period. You can't waive the second one if you already waived the first. So that's for the meal period. Must be at least 30 minutes. You can certainly do an hour, but make sure that they are released because they're on unpaid time. They are released to go and have their meal period where they would choose to. We can't require that they carry a pager or a phone for emergency calls. Otherwise, that becomes a paid meal period. All right, so we're not required to track, to police them to make sure they did it and say, you haven't gone yet, go, go, go. We are required to be very clear up front in what the requirement is. And that is this policy right here. We need to have it in our handbook. We need to tell them. Let's remind them in a staff meeting if people aren't following it. But you are not, because of the Brinker case, BRINKER, it was determined that the employer does not have to police it, and that was the word they used. However, if you know that people aren't taking their meal periods and you don't stop and do something about it periodically, that means we have tolerated a pattern of it and it no longer is it our policy. So there's kind of a fine line there. Remind people if you see that they're not doing it, watch those time cards, because the reason that they didn't take that meal period on time matters. If they say it was because of the press of business, there was a long line I had to serve. We need to make sure we've told them, don't make that decision on your own. Let your supervisor know and we'll get relief for you. Because otherwise the penalty is paying 1 hour of a premium at their regular rate of pay. So rest periods also. The law says this in very old English terms. And they say that an employee is entitled to a 10-minute rest period for every 4 hours they've worked or a major portion thereof. And as much as practicable, that's the funny word, as much as possible, in other words, we're going to try to get that 10-minute rest period, it can be 15, in about the middle of that 4-hour period, wherever possible. But keep in mind, this means a net, N-E-T, net 10 minutes. So if they have to walk somewhere else out of the manufacturing floor to get to a break room, or they're in the fields with agriculture and they have to walk to the shaded area where there's water, allow for that walking time. That cannot count against their 10-minute break. So that's one of the reasons why many employers just provide 15 minutes to make sure it's net. Here's a little chart of how many rest periods that we need to give. If somebody is working 6 to 10 hours, we need to make sure they've had at least 2 breaks plus a meal period. So I hope that table is helpful for you. Even if employees request it, we cannot allow them to combine their rest periods and take them all at once. You've heard that phrase, no good deed goes unpunished, because they may be your friend today, but all it takes is someone with a complaint or somebody who leaves unhappy. And if this process is described to any state agency that's investigating their complaint, they're going to come in and ask for records on what all of your employees are doing. So even if they ask to, can I just combine my 2 15-minute breaks the same time and leave early? No, we need to make sure that we're following the schedule that's laid out by the law. But do make sure you give them the freedom to leave during paid rest periods, especially. There is such a thing as an on-duty meal period, but if you're a note taker, right here, caution, 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 because the court cases have been coming back against employers for saying, you know, if it would have been possible for you to have a second person there to relieve them. Say, even one time in a mini mart case, they only had one cashier there overnight. One of the court rulings was, you were just being very tight and frugal with your costs. You should have had a second person there even for protection, and they could have relieved each other. So just that might be a precedent that's going to be looked at moving forward as to whether or not that's really a great example of the nature of the work preventing the employee from taking an uninterrupted break. One that has come up, even that's been 2 different decisions, is for security guards. Like if they're guarding the Target shopping center, for example, there is a ruling saying that they should have been able to be relieved and not required to stand guard. Even if there's a party going on, a floater guard needs to come in. So caution, caution on this one. It's becoming increasingly difficult to show the nature of the work prevented it.
And Brenda,
yes.
How would you recommend a manager manage their remote team when it comes to breaks and knowing when those are and making sure those are being taken, or is that not as much of an issue?
Great question. I think it's a communication issue. We can't be there monitoring because of privacy reasons. We can't keep a camera on their computer, but we can monitor the computer. Does it shut off? You don't even have to go that far. I would say if you have maybe a daily check-in with them to say, hey, how's it going? Are you finding time to find your 10-minute rest period as much as possible around the 2nd hour of work? Just a reminder, put it on your staff meeting agendas once a month. I know you're going to have more check-ins via Zoom, and it's just a great thing to remember. Is anyone feeling so compressed in your work that you're having difficulty taking your breaks? Please let me know, because we consider that still of critical importance even when you're working at home. Have it be on record somewhere that you told them that. What happens is if we don't, you're welcome, if we don't provide that meal period or rest period, then the penalty is 1 hour of pay at their regular rate of pay. That's called a premium hour. Potentially we could have 2 of those per day. So if they missed a meal period and a rest break, there could be 2 1-hour premiums that day. However, it caps at 2. So if they happen to miss 2 rest periods and their meal period, we only are obligated to pay them for 2 1-hour premiums. However, I would be coaching that employee and showing a written trail that you said, we're paying you, but this is a This is a penalty that we don't want to have you ignore in the future. You're creating potential liability for the company and not getting the rest that you need. Please monitor this more closely or it could result in disciplinary action. So you can correct and take action, but make sure you pay if you're aware of that. All right, I think most of you know about overtime, so I'll do this fairly quickly. If you're on a regular schedule, meaning you have not properly voted in an alternative workweek schedule, in California, we have to look at overtime on a daily basis of 8 hours, but also look at, did they exceed 40? Federal law just says 40 in a week, and you can work them 10 hours, 10 hours, 10 hours, and not be owing overtime. That's not the case in California. We also have to say, don't go over 8 hours in a day without paying at least 1.5 times their regular rate of pay for the hours between, say, when 8 hours finished, and if they stop work at 10, you owe 2 hours at 1.5 times their regular rate of pay. You owe double their regular rate of pay if they go over 12 hours. So that's something to schedule accordingly. That can get very costly. And if they work 7 days in a row in excess of 8 hours on the 7th consecutive day, it's double time for all hours worked over 8 on the 7th day in a work week. So regular rate of pay is not just their hourly rate. If you also have other kinds of pay in there, such as commission, remember, you've got to go factor that back in. If you give commission or you give a bonus that was promised or had a formula, you go 5% over your hours, then you're going to get $200 bonus. That's a formula bonus, and that then has to be incorporated into their regular rate of pay. So you would combine that into the pot that says, what all did I pay this person? And then how many hours did they work? Divide how many hours they worked by total hours paid, and that's your regular rate of pay. So if you need help with that, let me know. That's important because when you're calculating overtime, it's got to be at their regular rate of pay and not just their hourly rate. Something to keep in the back of your head. This may not be completely clear to you right now until you do it, but I just wanted to introduce to you that term, regular rate of pay, because it impacts the overtime rate if you pay commissions and bonuses. Okay, so there's some of the complicated stuff. Let me get into some of the other reporting time pay issues. So to guarantee that the employee gets at least some pay, if they report to work, they took the time to get all dressed up. If they're expecting to work an 8-hour shift, but you don't have enough work to keep them busy and they normally work 8 hours, you have to pay them half of their regularly scheduled shift. But in no cases can it be less than 2 hours. So let's say you have an employee who regularly works 6 hours and you only had 2 hours of work for them. What would you pay them? So they regularly work 6 hours and you had 2 hours of work. Do you owe them anything else? I know this is math. You actually owe them 1 extra hour, right? Because it has to be half of their regularly scheduled shift. And if they normally work 6 hours, you've got to pay them 3 hours. If they normally work 4 hours, like I know Pier 1 used to do that to their staff, they show up and only work them 1 hour, they owe them 2 hours. So that's that minimum threshold. Does that make sense? Okay, I see some nods. So here's another example.
We do have one question. What about if you have to send someone home because they are sick?
Okay, so good question. If they are not fit for work, and I'm about to cover that, then that is an exception. You would give them sick leave pay if they still had any remaining. But you would then just, if they're not fit for work, you don't have that half a shift requirement. But we're going to talk about that. So one more example, if an employee is scheduled to work an 8-hour shift but sent home after 5 hours, how many regular hours and reporting time hours are due? What do you think? Half of their normal shift would be 4, but they worked 5. Bingo, you've already met your half a shift, so there's nothing else to have to pay. I hope that helps. So to your question that Andy helped read for us, let's look at some of these exceptions. If there is a threat, like the fire department comes in and says, clear the property, we see smoke. Or if PG&E doesn't have water or gas on, or there's no public utilities or sewer system, that's an exception. Or if there's something they call an act of God, such as something outside the employer's control, like an earthquake, that would be considered an act of God. However, equipment breakdowns or problems with production line are not considered act of God, or they're considered within the employer's control, even though sometimes we know they're not in our control. So you would still have that reporting time pay if there's equipment breakdown, unless it was due to a power outage outside of your control. So here's the not fit for work. So someone comes in and you realize they have a fever and we've got to send them home due to COVID, or they're intoxicated and obviously they're not safe to work. Those are reasons why that you don't have to necessarily pay for reporting time. But I would say be very careful. If you are terminating somebody, I would still pay half of their reporting shift, because you don't want any pay shortage on their final check. If they're going to come up with a creative claim that says they were due for 4 hours, even though it only took you 15 minutes to terminate them, I would go ahead and pay at least half their shift for that last day. Because there's waiting pay penalties. If they wait 30 days with an attorney's advice and say, hey, you didn't pay me for 2 hours of reporting time pay that was due, or I didn't get paid for a missed meal period. Even if you only owe them 1 hour at $15, they're entitled to a full day's earnings, but they normally make for up to 30 days. So we want to be very careful about final pay issues. Any questions on that category? Okay, really quickly, you are not required by any law to keep a personnel file, technically, but you are required to maintain documents. These can be electronically stored, but we need to make sure that they follow 2 rules, that if an agency comes in and they need to examine the records, they have to be available and printable right away. And they must also be divided into separate electronic files or hard copy files to separate personnel information, like anything from their application to their performance evaluations to their write-ups, separate from anything that could be health-related medical information, even their W-4, because it has number of dependents on it. Those issues are considered non-employment, and they're personal facts that need to be kept separate. Same with benefit enrollment forms. They need to be in a separate file, because they may say, I have a cardiologist, and it would point to potentially a health condition. So make sure you have your records sorted into at least these 2 categories. And then just to give you an idea about how long you have to keep things, recruitment records, it's a minimum of 2 years. I would actually recommend, if you're a note taker, writing +1, because what we're experiencing is that sometimes employees wait longer to file a claim, and then you still have to produce records. If they say they were discriminated against, they weren't promoted, or they weren't hired, we call that constructive discharge, they now have 3 years to file a claim with DFEH, the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. So if you're a note taker, I would change this to say +1, just to be safe. Payroll records, time cards, 4 years is a requirement. The I-9 form, this can be a little confusing to hear, so let me see if I can make it as clear as possible. We have to keep it at least 3 years from the time they were hired. So lock that in, a minimum of 3 years. But it has to be kept at least a year after they leave the organization. So let's say they worked for you for 5 years. How long would they have to keep that I-9 form? Anyone? They work for you for 5 years, so we've met the 3 years, but we have to have 1 year after termination. So you have to keep that I-9 form in that case with a 5-year employee for 6 years. Does that make sense? So it's whichever is latest. I hope that helps. There's been a lot of confusion among that because they think it's just 3 years. No, if you've got a 20-year employee, you have to keep that I-9 form 21 years. If you've got a 1-year employee, you have to keep it at least 3 years. In no case does it go below 3 years. Health records, 5 years, unless there was something like a toxic exposure like asbestos, then you've got a 30-year requirement. Because cancer may take longer to manifest. Benefits data, including pension information, we've got to keep those for 6 years. If they have leave of absence, we've got to keep them at least 3 years. And that's frequently tied to a period that someone has to file a claim that we have to produce records to back it up. So I hope that is helpful. We just have about 8 minutes left by my clock. So I know we're gonna just be going very quickly. I wanna make sure that you all know when you have one employee, you should have a handbook because it's a roadmap. Not that employees are gonna read it cover to cover until they're mad, but it's very important to be able to have the guidelines of what is required. I would really recommend that you have job descriptions. And as you're growing, you're gonna change these. They're gonna be very fluid, but you wanna look at them at least every year when you do the performance evaluation to see, is that still what I have them doing? Because, yes.
I have a question. You talked about keeping records 1 year after if they met the 4 years. What's an acceptable record keeping system? Because you talked about a cloud. You talked about not having to have a file. How about when the banks that I used to work for, they had microfilm? Is that an acceptable storage? Because you're talking about employees that are 20, 25, 30. Some places can't afford to convert it or didn't have the insight to convert it. But they have to do it, and if they do it after the fact, that say you're going to the labor board, what are the answers to that?
Good question, Gabriel. So again, that rule is if an agency presents you with an audit or a claim, they have to be readily printable. So if you've got it in a system that you still have the equipment that you can print it out from, then it's acceptable.
Okay.
Great, thank you. So these are the essentials that we recommend that you have. So there's documentation in case for one, let's just be positive at first, just to help spell out the goals so that employees can be successful. I like to think of it first from that, we're setting them up for success. Make it clear what's expected. But also on the flip side, since I work with legal and have for 20 years, I also think about how to protect you as the company and the manager. And this documentation can really help show that you pointed out these issues and they didn't turn it around. So at will is something that I would really recommend you have in your handbook policy because it says you can let someone go for any reason or no reason. And that is, it can be undermined though, if you use phrases such as, we always follow progressive disciplinary action, because that means you've got a verbal, coaching, and then a written before we can terminate you. So you don't want to promise progressive disciplinary action, even though in many disciplinary situations, it's a very effective tool for you. Don't promise it, don't put that in your handbook, because that's what you always follow. you want to reserve the right to take action based on the seriousness of the violation. Don't use the word permanent employee because that negates at will. You can maybe say regular if you have some that are special projects or seasonal, maybe you can use the word regular. And unless you're a public agency, I really recommend you don't use a probationary period term, because if it's 90 days, for example, from day 1 to day 90, what's that mean? Oh, if it's not working out or you're not learning fast enough, we can just let you go. We don't have to explain it to you. So there is a mindset that what happens on day 91, that status somehow changed if they're no longer probationary. So we're saying you've gone from at will to not at will if you use probationary. If you have other questions about that, feel free to reach out, but that's your homework, is to look and make sure you don't undermine your at will. Otherwise,
I have a question. Say, it's okay, say I'm the person that's working in HR, right? And I leave after 10 years. How often should a company check that everything's running, within, do you check when a new person comes? Do they have to run an audit? How do you know that your stuff is copacetic?
that your HR practices are in line?
Yeah,
Actually, with every single employee relations action, I would be saying, is this consistent with what we did last time? And is it consistent with the new law? So I really like that you asked the question, but I certainly wouldn't wait 10 years. I would be looking at it from a consistency standpoint for precedents that you've set, but also to make sure that you get your handbook updated every single year to make sure it's compliant.
everybody gets the memo, right?
And then everybody gets a copy of the handbook, right? They have to sign for it. Yep, exactly. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Job descriptions, just a few pointers. Why are they so important? Because we want to point out what those essential job functions are. You see this listed here. These correlate to if someone says, oh, I hurt my back and I can no longer sweep. You can say that's in your essential functions. Safety is part of your whole role, and you were hired to make sure the floor is clean. If you can't sweep, you're not able to perform your essential function. You do not have to create a new position for that person. What you do is you just look at, are there any other positions open? Apart from that, if you've got the physical requirements for the job spelled out and tied to essential functions, includes pushing and pulling and maybe lifting, then that makes a real big difference in your Americans with Disabilities accommodations that you have to make. So those are key headings I would have on your job description. And I hope that's a quick start guide for you. Again, this is a brief overview. With performance appraisals, we want to make sure that the comments don't disagree with the scoring. If you said has shown some improvement in this area, you don't want to give them a 10 because it will be confusing. It will not stand up if challenged. So let's make sure that it's also consistent with what the performance areas are. You don't give them a halo rating so that they're a 4, 4, 4, 4, 4. We want to show some difference in what they perform well and things that they're not performing as well. Makes it more credible. I think that this is evidence. This is one of the first documents that an attorney is going to hold up in court if someone's claiming that you didn't give them good training and you terminated them before they had a chance to know what was required.
So Brenda, in relation to this, as well as the labeling of probationary period,
Yes.
A question that came in is, so should we not do 90-day reviews or just not call it a period of probation?
Great question. I really still encourage early reviews, especially for someone's first year in a job. I really recommend 90-day evaluations, but that's what I would call it, is your 90-day evaluation or your progress updates or your initial evaluation. We just don't want to call it probationary. Thank you. I know we are going to run out of time here because I believe we started at 2:20 and we said this would be 1 hour. Andy, correct me if I'm wrong. I am happy to go through the whole program, which probably would take us at least 10 minutes, or I can just speed through quickly. I want to go with what the participants.
Yeah, Keith, I'll leave that up to you. If you guys want, you can continue with the 10 minutes and then keep recording.
We need to, obviously somebody's not muting, but if they could mute, that'd be helpful. April, Esther, everybody, you guys want to stay on? I mean, everybody okay to stay on for another 10 minutes and let Brenda finish? Let's do it. Let's do it, Brenda.
And if anybody
we
wants
got
to
you.
log off, I completely understand because I like to honor your time commitments.
Perfect. Let's go.
Okay. So documentation, picture anything you put in writing as potentially being what we call discoverable. If there's a claim, the opposing attorney is going to ask for all email, all performance appraisals, the job descriptions. Frequently, they're going to ask for time records. So remember that documentation can be your best friend, or it can also bite us if it's not something that we should have in writing when it gets requested. But if you're coaching or you're doing corrective action, let's always make sure, even in coaching, to make some kind of note in the supervisor's performance file. If it's not a written warning, let's not have them sign it and put it in the personnel file because that sends a conflicting message. Now it becomes a written warning. But do document your coaching, what date you spoke with Brenda about her tardiness, and put it in your own supervisor fact file. Because then if it happens again, you at least say, you know, Brenda, we talked about this in February and it's still a problem. And so what's going to happen if it happens again? This will become a written warning. And then make a note of what they say. If they say, oh, I didn't realize it, I'll work harder, write that down. Because I had a case one time where an employee said after she got a written warning, oh, when you talked to me about this, I forgot to tell you that my school doesn't open till 8 o'clock, so I can't open that gate and get to work until 8:15. Well, I can pull out the notes and say, you didn't say that when we did a coaching. So it really helps in eliminating some excuses. And then follow up. That is important enough to point out. Put a little tickler on your Outlook to follow up so that it doesn't seem like you were just in a disciplinary mood that day and it wasn't really all that important. If you say you're going to follow up, we need to make sure we schedule that. I've had this happen to me where I have seen documents blown up in court. So that's why I wanted to emphasize this. And all of your records can be subpoenaed. They're called discoverable. So you have to picture, I had an attorney pick apart an email one time where I said, I didn't want to do this to create any additional liability. And so the attorney said, what did you mean additional? Was there initially liability? So you want to be very careful, even what is put in an email. As I mentioned, the supervisors are the front line. So the most important thing I can say is that if an employee comes to you and says, I'm being bullied, or I didn't get my meal period, a lot of times inside we're rolling our eyes, which is don't let that show on the outside. So we do want to stop and look into what they say, even though it may not actually be a valid concern. It may be a personality conflict. Let's not show that initially when we talk to them, or they may decide to go to an outside agency next time and not tell us about it at all. Confidentiality is important too, so that if they say that they are going to have surgery and they happen to tell you what kind of surgery, make sure the only information that we share with others has to do with what they need to know, for example, scheduling to cover their shift. You don't have to say what the nature is of that surgery. Keep it as confidential as possible. It's going to not only determine your trust, but it could help avoid HIPAA violations or other kinds of lawsuits or harassment complaints. So here's my rule of thumb. This is something that I say, that if someone tells me about something that's either unlawful, immoral, or unsafe, then it must be reported up. And I let the employee know that right up front, so they don't think it's a shared secret between us, that you're going to need to report this up to your manager. So those are my three. You might come up with something that's helpful to you, but you can still be discreet to the extent possible. So let's not go through this for the sake of time. I love scenarios because I'm into interactive training. So I did give these to you. I'd be curious in your views, and if you need to know the answers to these, email me later. Some of them are good. The important thing I wanted to cover with leaves before we close is that a lot of it depends on your size as an employer, what is required. So someone have a question? Okay, so you're going to want to follow this. What's the universe of leaves that possibly the person may be eligible for and that I, as the employer, may need to offer? The big one that's changed just within the last few weeks is California Family Rights Act. We call it CFRA. You've probably heard of that. It used to apply to 50 or more, and there was a new parent leave that applied if you had 20 or more, but CFRA now applies to employers who have 5 or more. So this pretty much impacts all of us now. Anybody on the payroll, part-time, full-time, on leave. And so what it allows them to do is take at least up to 12 weeks off without pay. It's unpaid up to 12 weeks if they have completed at least 1 year of service and have worked at least 1,250 hours. So that would include part-timers who've worked at least 24 or 25 hours a week in the 12 months before the start of the leave they'd like to take. And they have at least 5 or more employees working near them. So let's say you have an office in Fresno and then you open a 1-person satellite office in San Francisco. The Fresno people would be eligible, but the San Francisco would not, because there's greater than a 75-mile radius. That means you're not required to do it. So why can they take it? If it's their own serious health condition, if it's to care for a family member who has a serious health condition, or baby born or adopted for bonding, or if there's a military call to duty that they can act on to ask for a leave within 7 days. So again, 12 work weeks in the 12-month period that you identify. Is it prior to the start of the leave, or is it prior from their last leave? And they don't have to take it all at once. It could be off and on. Keep in mind, I think everyone knows about California paid sick leave by now, but think of them as like magic days. We cannot ask them the reason. We cannot deny it if they still have any California paid sick leave, PSL, left. You can restrict their using it until they've had 90 days of employment. So again, you cannot discipline them. That's why we think of them as magic days. You can either front load, what's usually 24 hours if you have full-time employees. If you have an alternative work week schedule, it might be 10 times 3, it might be 30 hours. But they need to accrue at least 1 hour for every 30 hours. And I'm just giving you the calculation for full-time employees, 1.33. So I think you know about that. Here's some examples of some of the leaves. I'd like you to go back and use this as a checklist to see what leaves might they have available. I've tried to give you some good guidelines, like FMLA is 50 or more. FEHA is state law, Fair Employment and Housing Act. We've got to make reasonable accommodations for things that are not essential functions, right? And jury duty, we have to allow time off, but it does not have to be paid. As we start to close, I want to just say my concern in protecting you too is to pay attention to those wage and hour guidelines that we covered, especially meal and rest periods and overtime, because that's where attorneys are swooping in, asking for pay records, and then finding a complaint, because they can catch us on even the name on the paycheck if it doesn't have our address on it or our full business name. And then they're asking for pay records if even one person missed a meal period. Let's make sure that the performance evaluations and all documentation is consistent with how we've treated others and well supports any termination decision. And then if you don't have your own HR department, there's also outsourced HR, which is like companies like ours, or you may have a general manager who's at the top that's a clearinghouse for all action, so that this person can say, that's not what we've done in production, and we can make sure we're as consistent as possible in all departments, because otherwise you may not know. Lastly, if you have to terminate somebody, I just hope everyone knows that you've got to give an employee their final paycheck and all pay. If you terminate them and you're the moving party, you've got to have it ready on the spot when you terminate them. But if they resign and give you 3 days notice, we've got to also have the paycheck ready. You can't wait for the next pay period if they've given us the 72 hours of notice. But if they walk off the job or resign without notice, you do have 72 hours to get that paycheck ready. Remember, waiting pay penalties can start to accrue at their regular rate of pay for up to 30 days full wages, if anything's been missing. And this is not just business hours, weekends and holidays are included. And as much as we would like to, we can't say, yeah, if you bring me back in that company phone, then I'll give you the paycheck. No, that's withholding what's due. The employer cannot be in any better position than any other company that the employee might owe money to, such as their mortgage or their PG&E. We cannot withhold that paycheck in lieu of getting property returned. You can engage in a separate agreement with them. If they had a loan and didn't pay it back, you can come to payment terms, but you cannot withhold it from the final check. So make sure it just has all hours due and pay out any unused vacation or PTO that they accrued. You do not have to pay out sick leave, just vacation or PTO. All right, I think I talked about cannot deduct payments in the final paycheck, such as not returning tools or equipment. So parting shot memory. Remember, we don't want to have our head in the sand. Even after we get this fish tank set up beautifully, it does require some maintenance, and we do need to keep up to date with the changing laws, especially in California. Whew, thank you for your extra time in getting us through that. I know that was a breeze in some areas. I'm available for questions as long as you need me. Let me open up the floor.
Brenda, first of all, you are awesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
My pleasure. You asked great questions along the way, but let me just hold for a moment, and with Andy's help, we'll see if there's any chats or any questions that you'd like to pose.
Oh, I have a question. My name's Esther. I'm sorry I was a little bit late. So if we introduced ourselves at the beginning, I missed that. It's been Zooming all day long.
I understand.
We are in the middle of putting together our employee handbook right now. I do realize it's a little late because we have 3 employees already. So I guess my big question is, I have a draft done. I think I'm just nervous that I missed something, or legally there's not something in there that is there a cheat sheet somewhere that has like, here's what has to be in your HR book? Your employee handbook.
Right. There are different memberships that do provide that. As long as it's California specific, and I know Cal Chamber does have something, the downside is that it doesn't necessarily know how to customize it for you for your size. Because those lead laws that I briefly showed you, they don't have to be in there if you don't have a certain number of employees, and I certainly wouldn't want to put them in there. So that's something that I have a certified team that does that too, or you might start by seeing what you can Google and find out there, but put in California employee handbook to make sure that you don't just get a federal compliant handbook, because we're very different. Great question.
You're saying that you guys offer the service to look over that and check,
Yes,
make sure. So if we don't have an HR department, you guys offer that service as well.
absolutely. That's what we specialize in.
Okay.
Is there any updated guidance that you know of that would pertain to nonprofits regarding all of the COVID standards for somebody who's been exposed, that type of thing? I looked on even Fresno County Public Health, and their guidance is from July, but it seems like it goes back and forth. You can work after 7 days without being exposed, or you can't until the 14 days. So
Right.
it's very
you know what?
confusing.
I don't blame you for being confused. Not only is that not up to date, but then we've got got 3 different entities at least that we're trying to follow, and they're saying different things. So you've got Cal OSHA, it's still saying 14 days. You've got Fresno orders and state orders that are different. Overall, there is a general consensus, even though Cal OSHA has not formalized this yet, that there's a 10-day quarantine from the time someone has symptoms or tests positive. And that applies to all agencies. Now, there are some orders that apply specifically to certain industries. So I don't want to give you a blanket answer. If you're in the meat processing, you're going to have something different. But just in general orders, if you're a business type nonprofit, the generally accepted, although not completely Cal OSHA up to date, number is 10 days. It's a good practice. It's agreeable that it's a good practice if there are no symptoms to keep it 14 days, because it may take some time for those symptoms to manifest. But again, we're dealing with conflicting information.
Right. And those 14 days are all have to be paid.
Well, if they still have some of that emergency pay sick leave, you voluntarily can opt to still extend that through March 1st, that they can take that. This is not an extension beyond 80 hours that they were originally given. But if they haven't used their 80 hours from in the fall, you can voluntarily as an employer opt to extend that time frame for them to use those original 80 hours all the way up to March 1st.
Okay, thank you.
Otherwise, it does not have to be paid. You may choose to, because it's a good practice to keep people out of the office. Other questions? I realize I probably opened the door to a lot of areas that need to be drilled down into deeper, but I wanted you to at least think, oh, I heard something about that one time. Let me stop and do some research or call somebody or get some help, so that at least you've heard something briefly. And I've given you our website here. Let me also give you my email address. If you email me and tell me you're in this presentation, I'm not going to charge you to answer a question. Just tell me you were part of this presentation. Just as a courtesy follow-up, I will do my best to help you. And that email is Budke, which is my last name here, B-U-D-K-E, at sierrahr.com.
Well, now you've opened Pandora's box, Brenda. You really have.
If it sounds like it's something more than answering a question to clarify something and you need help like reviewing a handbook, that will be a little different. That'll be a project. But I would love
This is super. Well, I just want to thank you. I think everybody else has thanked you in the chat in other ways, and it was very, very meaningful. And every time I hear this, I realize how much I don't know about your profession. So thank you so much for sharing again about how much I don't know. And just thank you, Andy, for putting this together after we identified Brenda as our key source. And we'll be figuring out a way as a CDP to have more regular TA like this. And we hope maybe Brenda might be involved in that. And this was your introduction to her and her knowledge and skillfulness. So maybe now's the time just to say, have a great afternoon, and we just keep moving, huh?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Brenda.
Thank you very much, Brenda.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. That was wonderful.
Well, I
That
hope
was such a value.
good.
Yeah, thank
You
you.
go
It
fast?
No, I think Keith is right. I think it opened a door for maybe people to begin the journey of digging into whatever area, that they didn't know about or need an update. And
Okay.
so I was talking to Andrew privately in the chat. We do have a monthly meeting that's coming up next Wednesday. And so it's clear that this is, especially by their questions and interaction in the chat, that this is an area they need to grow in. And so we're just going to talk to them about, I know initially you mentioned a monthly service that we could look into. So we'll get a feeling from our folks and see how detailed they want to dig into HR and have that as a resource in the future. And then I can follow up with you after that. But yeah, but what you did for them is incredibly valuable. Thank you so much.
I hope it gets them on the right track. It was my pleasure.
Yeah. Well, you have a wonderful day.
All right, you too. Thank you for hosting.
Okay, thank you.
Bye for now.